Do you ever wonder how great leaders in the community make things happen? When they encounter new, unexpected challenges like a pandemic, how do they continue to successfully make an impact? Welcome to That Sounds Terrific, the podcast that connects you with these amazing people. Get insights on what they do to meet their goals, find out how you can help them in their mission, and learn their methods so you can be more successful at what you do. Welcome to That Sounds Terrific with host Nick Koziol.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of That Sounds Terrific. I'm your host, Nick Koziol, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Lindsay Hotmire. She is a brilliant storyteller, a brilliant LinkedIn poster. I've been following you for quite some time. I don't know why we haven't had you on the show yet. Welcome to the show.
Oh my goodness. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course. So storytelling is a super important thing for really anyone. But can you just tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and your business and kind of how you got involved in storytelling?
Yeah. So a little bit about me from a business perspective. So I'm the founder and CEO of Storyhouse 15, and I work with small business owners and what I call do-good organizations who consider themselves change makers. And typically I partner alongside coaches, consultants, small business owners, mission-driven organizations who know that they've got a great story to share, who know that they've built a great culture, and they know that their mission is worthy. It's a very worthy mission, but they need the right strategy to better communicate that to the people that they're trying to serve, whether that's internally or externally. So I come alongside them really in two ways, either as a clarity coach or a brand positioning strategist. And I help them find the clarity and the strategy that they need so that they can own their calling, share their story, and grow their impact. And so that's what Storyhouse 15 does. Me personally, I've been in the world of education, nonprofits, marketing for 25 years, mom of four, getting ready to celebrate year 27 of marriage, which I don't know how that's possible. And
Congratulations.
owner of one golden doodle who thinks that she's human. Anybody who has
So you have 5 children.
basically, and one son-in-law. And so really 6.
Nice. Nice. I have 4 kids too, so that's a really cool thing I didn't know about you. That's awesome.
Yes.
So.
Yep. But they're all almost out of the house, which is a weird place to be. It's a interesting new phase of life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a new chapter in a story, right? So we were just talking off air about my first is going off, and you're sort of on the tail end of that. So it's an interesting perspective that I'll have to learn more about. But kind of I love what you do, honestly. And going back to the posting, especially on LinkedIn, you have a really great approach to sharing nuggets of knowledge with your network and anyone that comes across your post. And I look forward to seeing the story unfold, especially when you have your own kind of podcast and series that you share all these different things on. So why don't you tell a little bit more about that part of the craft and I think I know the reason why you do it, but why do you do that?
Why am I a storyteller?
Yeah.
I actually was just thinking about this question yesterday, what's the true origin of why does this matter so much? And I don't, I'm sure that there's many connecting pathways for me as far as why I think story is such a powerful tool to shape who we are and who we become. I think that I think we have been divinely created to be moved by story. I think that it is a part of our DNA as humans to just really reach in and shape us. I think that the two driving questions of story, especially when we think about it with our audience and when we're sharing, is people come into story asking two driving questions. Who are you? And who will I become when I join you? And that last piece is the really powerful piece for me. And that's the piece I was thinking about yesterday. I grew up in a house of 4 children as well. There were 4 girls in my house. My poor parents had 4 daughters, and I was daughter number 2. And I watched my parents kind of make something out of nothing. And they came from really difficult backgrounds, super, super like movie-worthy trauma backgrounds. And so the fact that they're still married 50 plus years later, I think is miraculous. But what I saw, and I didn't realize at the time as a child growing up, is I saw them taking control of the story that they were going to create for themselves and for the legacy that they were going to create for their daughters and their grandchildren.
Mhm.
And that was really powerful. There was a time my dad sat on the porch with his own father as an adult and just said, "I will be the change." And so as I watched that struggle for my dad to rewrite that story, it wasn't an easy process. It wasn't this movie style, transformation where it just looked all easy and beautiful.
Mhm.
There was a lot of struggle involved. And I think that those childhood days were like the foundational aspects for me of seeing the transformative power of story and what can happen when we really intentionally shape the stories that we're writing, and just the profound effects of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. What an amazing story to kind of come from and to kind of recognize. And congratulations to your parents too for
Yeah.
50 years of marriage. It's an amazing feat for anyone. I feel like my wife's gonna kick me out someday just because I annoy her so much. No, but yeah, I think something that I wanted to touch on was like sort of the power of story, but also the origin of story. When you think back, I mean, it wasn't long ago where we didn't have social media, we didn't have LinkedIn for Lindsay to post her awesome knowledge nuggets on, right? We had the storytelling. Is a big part of human history. So kind of going to what you said, it is part of like our culture. It is in our blood, right? When you think about um, before we could write things down, even we were telling tales and spreading knowledge through, the storytellers in the village, right? Sharing the do's and don'ts of their societal culture and like the legends and everything. So there's a lot of history there. And so like you mentioned very early on in the podcast about how you help a variety of different types of people, you have different types of clients. What do you help them exactly do? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Mhm. I talk about story kind of in with three basic using three basic tools. I talk about tiny stories, your sacred bundle, and the habits of story. And so the first thing that I do is help my clients move past what I call the lie of the big story.
Hmm.
I think especially, you just talked about social media and the digital age and how that has shifted story, into this different lane that we didn't grow up with it being,
Hmm.
before us didn't. Um, and I think what that has done is storytelling becomes more popular and more talked about. Everybody knows, well, I've got to share my story. There's this idea, I think, that it has infiltrated how we step into story, where we feel that it has to be really big. Like, well, I have to have scaled this, tell the story where I scaled the 7 summits, or where
Hmm.
I had this near-death experience, or where, this rags to riches stories. You can read the books about all the different story themes that we should and could be sharing. And while having a big story is fine and great. Big stories are the types of stories that can turn heads and get an audience to notice you quickly. But I don't think big stories are the types of stories that foster relationship and community, because they're not the ones that make you feel relatable, approachable, and safe and real to your audience. Those are what I call tiny stories. Those are the small everyday moments that are unfolding, that actually do, human to human stories that said, I did this and I'm normal. I'm human. Look, I'm on the same ground that you are. You can do this too. And I think that when we learn to embrace, to find and to embrace those tiny stories, it makes storytelling more possible for
Hmm.
people. I hear a lot story experts telling business people, just share your story, just share what happened in your day, or um, just share that one, the story of the one time that you were on a train platform in France and some guy walked up to you and you had this interaction. Like, just talk about those things. And while that's true, and I don't disagree, what I also know from my clients is that tapping into those moments is really hard. Like,
Hmm.
I don't know what to share, Lindsay,
Hmm.
and when do I share it? Like, I'm professional here. I don't want to be an oversharer. I don't want to be over vulnerable or be
Right.
accused of manipulating my audience. Like, it
Hmm.
just isn't natural. And so that advice of just do it, it reminds me of a meme that my daughter shared with me a couple years ago. She definitely is a very anxious now woman, but so in high school, she just had all this anxiety, and she showed me this meme. It was this old man who had his hands in the air, and it was something like, when you tell somebody just stop being anxious, like, right, if it was that easy, we would do it.
Hmm.
Um, and so that storytelling, just tell your story, that advice reminds me of that. Like, it's
Yeah.
not that easy for a lot of people. And so I come alongside my clients and I help them find the pathways to finding those tiny stories, not just once, but
Hmm.
repeatably. I simplify it for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a necessary support that people need. Like there's a skill to telling your story. And there is fear. When we go back to again to social media and sort of like the instant fame people can get, or infamy people can get from even having the best intentions. Like I don't remember the guy's name, but I kind of remember the situation where there was this gentleman who had to let someone go, and he shared the story on LinkedIn and how he felt, and there was huge backlash, right? Around that he's not the victim kind of here, and so it's interesting how stories can kind of backfire on us as well.
Right.
And so that, like, even with some of the things that I do for this podcast, it's about sharing kind of other people's stories. I have a little disclaimer at the bottom of a form saying, that we're going to share this, right? And don't, don't sue me, please, kind of a thing. But like, if something goes wrong, it's my show, right? I'm kind of relating that story, and I have myself have a lot of trouble kind of sharing my own personal stories. So
Mhm.
episode 99 of That Sounds Terrific was Ben Albert coming in and talking to me because I've had a number of people saying, hey, we don't know as much about you,
Mhm.
from your
Yeah.
show, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, like, what can you talk a little bit about sort of that, how you, like, you mitigate maybe the danger of a story? How do you develop the story with the client? What are some kind of cool tips and tricks that Lindsay can share about
Yeah.
sharing stories?
Yeah. And so that's where those next two tools come into place, the habits of story and the
Hmm.
sacred Bible. And so I'll talk about the habits first. We all know the data behind habits. I'm not a habit expert, but we
Hmm.
know when we were kids, it takes 21 days to form a habit. I just recently read it takes 60 some days to
Oh,
form a habit now, so it's longer.
we
Okay.
regressed.
We formed habits in 21 days, so but
Okay,
now it takes 66. And
we're
we
slow
know
now.
that, when you want to excel at something, when you want to become the expert in something, when you want to stand out, when you want to do something well, you're going to increase your chances of that if you form habits around doing that thing.
Mhm.
And so the same holds true for story, especially when you're trying to find these tiny stories, is that especially if you're not just this natural storyteller, like some people just move through the world constantly thinking in story. Everything is a story, which would be me. But if you're
Mhm.
not a natural storyteller and a story thinker, then these habits of story can be a really good and easy way for you to get into the habit of finding the stories that are happening every day. Like I say, stories are unfolding every second of every day.
Mhm.
And so if we can just tune in, you're going to see them. And that's the problem. We're not tuning in. And so there's three habits. The first is observe. Just really simple.
Mhm.
Observe what's happening around you. Pay attention to people's body language, to your own interactions within the world, how you're moving through the world. Um, just observe the world around you. So, as an example, I think this was maybe 2 years ago, I was on a run and I, you know, because I'm uber paranoid, I take the same route all the time. Like I'm not going to leave my neighborhood and I'm going to take the same route. So I'm running the same blocks over and over again. You know, hundreds of times I've gone around this block. And one particular day I don't even know if I had music in my ears. I'm just running and I see something I've never seen before. How's that possible? I've gone around this block both in my car and with my legs, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times. But because I was observing, I noticed something I had never seen before. And it actually was a pretty powerful notice. Like whatever was going on in my life and in my mind at the time, it was like that thing stood out to me in a way that had a special message just for me because I was observing. And so when we step into the world as an observer, we're able to see things that maybe we would miss before. The second habit is listen. Listen first, speak last. You know, just pretty basic habit. I think that most of us would agree with, but few of us are really good listeners. And so go into a meeting and determine I'm going to listen more than I speak. Ask yourself when you're talking with somebody and you walk away, did I learn something I didn't already know? Because if you didn't, then you're probably not listening well enough. Listen to conversations between coworkers. Listen to conversations that your audience is having. Just step in as a listener, and you're going to find stories that you wouldn't find if you're stepping in as a non-listener. And then the last habit is do what you say you believe. And when you're when you're practicing the habit of observing and listening, you can really assess, am I actually doing what I say I believe? It's really easy to have values and to have ideals and to put them out there as this is what we stand for. But if you're not stepping back and assessing, are we really doing it? Then the stories that you're telling probably aren't going to be very authentic, which back to that poor guy on LinkedIn who posted the picture of him crying. I don't know the details behind that. Like, I don't know what led up to that. I don't know what kind of LinkedIn presence he had before that, but I do know he got skewered, which is terrible. Like that's probably not what he wanted to have happen. That's not the type of viral response he was going for, but it probably hints to him not doing what he said he believed. Like if he wasn't showing up before as that type of person, if he wasn't proving before he did that thing that he was a person who cared about his audience, he probably very much cared about his team. But if he wasn't putting stories in place to prove that, you can't just show up once and expect people to be like, wow, what an amazing person with an amazing story. And so those are the 3 habits. And when you practice them either daily or weekly, you start to find stories pretty naturally. And so you're not just sitting there in your office staring out your window for 2 hours trying to think, what should I say? You've been practicing these habits. You've been journaling them. You've been writing them down, these moments that stand out to you. And those eventually become bigger moments and bigger stories that you can share. But I give a container, and I'm going to pause here for a minute so you can ask any follow-up questions. But, you know, habits, no matter what habit we practice, it's like we need a framework, we need a scaffolding, or we need a container to put those habits in so that they can actually be practiced consistently. And so how do we observe? How do we listen? How do we do? Like, what am I looking for, Lindsay? Like, it's that same question of what stories am I supposed to be telling? And so the last tool is the sacred bundle. And that's the tool that I give that you use as kind of that guiding force for how do you practice these habits.
No, it's very interesting. It's there's a lot in there that I could probably spend another 2 hours kind of unpacking some of the things that I was thinking when you were talking about all the things that you have to do in order to kind of listen and get that story out, those everyday things. And journaling is a super important thing that I've kind of gotten away from, that I personally need to start getting back to, because I don't have the vault memory that I can remember all these things that are happening. So that's definitely something. But what popped in my head, is a common, thing that happens, especially in people in businesses, where they're trying to tell a story. Like a lot of businesses are trying to tell their story, their brand, and all that, but they sort of ignore, you know, the one of the most important parts of their story, which is their employees.
Mm,
A lot of companies have like their customers' needs and their potential customers' like wants and all that stuff all in order, but then they ignore the people that are trying to deliver that message, and they sort of fall away from, the actual story, right?
mm, mm,
Which they're storytellers that are in their team, right?
mm,
So
mhm.
I'm sure you encounter some of that, and I'm sure that's a somewhat common thing for, even that CEO or that head person to kind of fall away from um, following their own brand and their own story, and being able to listen, right, to their
Right,
employees.
right.
So, what is like, what is something that maybe you would suggest around, like, again, listening and being able to actually hear and consume that knowledge when maybe story isn't being shared in the right way?
Yeah. Well, the sacred bundle unpacks a lot of that, but
Hmm.
before I dig into that, the
Sure.
the simple answer is to just go back to that habit of story of listen. Listening requires you to have conversations, and I think a lot of times there's decisions being made without conversations being had.
Hmm.
And and I get that as a leader, especially, like I'm really averse to peering in at what a leader is doing and criticizing that, because I think
Hmm.
that there's a lot of finger pointing going on at leaders right now
Hmm.
from people who maybe haven't been in those shoes. And so I'm very much a leader ally. I
Hmm.
haven't been at the helm of an organization leading it, and I don't know what that's like. I've stood shoulder to shoulder with leaders who have done that, and so I
Right.
know the burden that they carry. It's hard. Like they're trying to run a business, they're trying to keep revenue flowing so that they can pay their team. And so there needs to be that two-way conversation going on so that that human connection doesn't get lost, so that the leader remembers who they're leading. They're actually human beings with fears and needs and wants and desires. I talk about something called the hungry belly syndrome,
Hmm.
and that there's often, like, if we're trying to lead people towards a vision and they're not coming along with us, it's probably because they have hungry bellies. It's probably because they have needs lower on that Maslow's hierarchy that haven't been met. So we can't pull them up to that higher level with us because
Hmm.
their buckets aren't full in those lower levels. You can't know that unless you're having conversations. And so that are you having conversations? If you're struggling to get other people to share the story, if they're not doing it in the way that you want them to, it's because they haven't bought into the vision. And so you need to have
Hmm.
conversations to understand why, what's preventing them. Do they have hungry belly syndrome? Are they just worried about their next paycheck? Are they wondering, is my job even going to be here?
Hmm.
Are there things you need to address at the lower level? And if you can do that, then they can buy into the vision and start sharing the story and feel equipped to do it. They feel a part of that story sharing process, and
Hmm.
they'll change.
Yeah, those uncertainties definitely linger in the minds of, the people that are working for that leader, right? Especially if that leader isn't good at communicating or talking and listening to the story and then acting on any of the things, right?
Right,
Because that's
right,
another part of it. Is like you might hear, their story, but if you don't seemingly react and try to make things better, then it can get even worse, right?
right.
So,
Yep, yep.
but I do want to talk more about that, the sacred bundle, and going into that part of your process. So, I want to listen.
Yeah. So the sacred bundle is not my idea at all. This comes from Native American culture, where when they were moving from place to place, either of their own will or not, they would take with them, they created these sacred bundles, which were just collections of objects, be it a feather, a piece of yarn, a bowl, an owl bone, or whatever it would be, pieces of fabric. They would pull these pieces together and put them in this sacred bundle. It might be really small, it might be large enough that it straps across your back and you bundle it up and you carry it. And they would take that with them from place to place, and during celebrations, special events, or just whenever, they would pull the tribe around them. Young and old would gather around them, and they'd unwrap this sacred bundle. And piece by piece, they would tell the story of these objects. And those stories represented the core facets of who they were as a tribe. And that's how they held themselves together as a tribe. They knew that if they'd stopped telling those stories, their tribe would die out, the culture would die out. And so those objects represented what they believed, who they were as a people, who they wanted to continue to be as a people. All of those important aspects is what that sacred bundle represented. You couldn't take away from the bundle, you could add to it, but you had to add to it in a very thoughtful way, because those stories would be told and retold, retold. And so in the 90s, there was an organizational consultant. Her name is Peg Newhouser, and she kind of brought this idea of the sacred bundle to the mainstream, organizational culture. Said organizations need their own sacred bundles. And so from a storytelling perspective, I think that thinking through the stories that we find and share through this concept of the sacred bundle is really powerful. And it really is the container that kind of you practice your habits through. Like, again, how do I observe? How do I listen? What am I looking for? What am I doing? How do I do? And so the 4 stories that I say need to be 4 types of stories that need to be in your sacred bundle as a business or an organization need to be stories of belief. And so that's really, what do we believe? What are the non-negotiable values that we order our lives and our world by? The second is legacy. What do we want to be remembered for long after I'm gone? Is it just how much money I made, or am I here to do something else? Calling. What is the unique calling that's been placed upon my life? This is more than just purpose. I think that an organization can have a large purpose, but if each person understands their unique contribution to that purpose, that's their calling. What are we doing, or what am I doing that nobody else can do to move this forward? It reminds me of a story that my husband told me, and I don't know if this is true or if this is just like an anecdotal tale, but there's a story of a janitor at NASA. Have you heard this story?
Not maybe. I actually had a story in mind too, but go ahead.
Okay. Janitor at NASA, and he was asked, whenever he was asked, what do you do at NASA? His reply was, I help get people to the moon. I mean, his job was to throw trash away and to keep things clean, but he understood his calling as so much greater. Like, he understood his role in the whole organization was, even though some would look at that as small, like, you don't have this brilliant mind of a scientist. He understood what he did kept things running, and he was part of that shared purpose, that shared that shared calling. He understood what that was. And I just think that's a really powerful story when you think about calling, and does everybody in my organization, whether it's just me, whether I'm a solopreneur or I'm running a team, does everybody understand how their unique calling plays into the bigger purpose? And then the last story that needs to be in our sacred bundle are stories of community. And that goes back to that question I said, who will others become when they join us? And so do the people in your community know the answer to that, whether that's internally or externally? Do they know, if I join Lindsay, this is who I'm going to become as a result of working alongside of her, as a result of partnering with her? And so belief, legacy, calling, and community, those are the 4 different types of stories that you need to think through and make part of your sacred bundle. And then when you're practicing those habits, so let's go up to the habit of observe. So you're going to ask yourself daily or weekly, what did I observe this week that reinforced a belief that I have, my legacy that I want to live out, the calling, or the community that I'm building? You want to use those 4 types of stories to help you practice those habits. And as you answer those, that's going to lead you to your tiny stories. So it's like this flywheel, just all works together.
No, that is awesome, and definitely something I should be doing on a more structured level, right? Like, I am that type of person that I have a million things coming at me at once, and I'm doing a million things. So like, I don't take enough time to kind of sit down and like work out those details. I'm also taking courses for my ADD, and that has helped me to restructure because it's become super necessary, especially with the research aspect. So, so no, this is all like super important, terrific information to be hearing for not only for me, for the audience too, to kind of like take that time to be able to tell those tiny stories. You need to observe, you need to listen. And the story that I thought of was similar in nature to the NASA one, but it's also sort of like that top-down mentality of going back and understanding that every person that you employ, right, has a contribution. So just like the NASA janitor, this was a story that stuck with me for years and years and years. I'm not sure which toothpaste company it was. I think it might have been Colgate. But what happened was every year the company would have like sort of a suggestion box for employees to put their suggestion in and how to sell more toothpaste, right? And
Mm-hmm.
anyone can enter it, and then there's like sort of this bonus that you'd get at the end of the year for the best idea or whatever. And so the janitor, I think it was the janitor, a custodian, put in that everyone puts their toothpaste on the same way. You kind of go along the line. Said, so why don't we make the cap wider, that tube wider at the end? Because then they're using more product. They're not going
Really?
longer and going shorter, but they're
Mhm.
using more products. So then they, finish their toothpaste quicker. And that was the idea that won it. And it didn't come from a product designer. It didn't come from, a design engineer. It came from the mind of your everyday employee, right? That had the opportunity to speak.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think stories like that and the NASA story are just so moving and can be celebrated at a company wide, or even emulated in other ways of life.
Yeah.
So but that's what I was thinking of when you were telling that NASA story. It's like, oh yeah, that kind of reminds me of the story. So
I love that.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just getting in touch again with those small everyday moments that make us relatable, approachable, and real to our audience requires that we show up as relatable, approachable, real to the people that own those stories. We can't find them if we're not showing up and looking for them.
Hmm.
And so yeah, that's just that. And I think that as our world becomes more and more immersed in the realm of the artificial, we're going to
Hmm.
see need for this even more, a desire for this. It's just really interesting to kind of watch. I'm definitely not ever one to be at the tip of the spear. My
Hmm.
husband is very much, but that's not me. I'm going
Hmm.
to sit back and I'm going to watch things. And so even now as things are shifting, AI is doing whatever it's doing.
Hmm.
It's just interesting to watch kind of the tug and pull of, well, this is where we're going from a technological standpoint. And then from a human standpoint, we're rising up and saying, but what about meaning? What about purpose? What about humanity? It's that
Hmm.
age-old question from the beginning of time of what does it mean to be human?
Right.
And that question is getting louder and louder. And so we need tools to thoughtfully and effectively actually answer that. And you have to be intentional because there is so much noise. If you aren't intentional about it, you're not going to be able to thoughtfully and powerfully answer that question.
That's totally true. And yeah, AI is an interesting conundrum.
Yeah.
I think you kind of are spot on with using it as a tool, right?
Mhm.
I've shared that even in the research and stuff that I've been doing, that I see it more as a tool that we should be teaching about and learning about, but not a replacement, right?
You're
To the
right.
human story and to the human meaning. But I guess it's coming at a time also where we have so much access to so much information. And the other part of it is it's very hard to tell, like, what is the truth and what is a lie, and what the angle is, depending on, who you're speaking to,
Mm.
and where you're getting that data, right? So you've been doing this for a number of years now. You've got, your system. You've got a number of clients you've been working with. I'm sure you have some sort of terrific success stories. I'd love to hear just one, whether it be, your own personal success or a client success or something that, a great story about like kind of using these methods to get those messages out there.
Yeah. So one of the stories that I have, and I share this on my site, case study that I have, was working, this was right kind of during and after COVID. So hard time for businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so a marketing agency contacted me, a two-man agency, so pretty small, but worked primarily with other agency owners. That's what they do now. Um, and we had done some work together, and obviously because they're in the marketing world, in the agency world, they're very adept and knowledgeable about what works in marketing and what doesn't. But again, it goes back to they knew they had a great story. They knew that they were doing great things. They knew that they had built a great culture, but they weren't able to do that strategy piece. They weren't able to find the story themselves that they really needed to be sharing. They were in this pivot phase. They had started out as a podcasting agency, and they were pivoting to be more holistic, and they just didn't know how to do all of that. And so they had this goal to get to, I think it was $1.2 million in revenue. And so we worked together. I really helped them take that step back to really think through those ideas in the sacred bundle, and to find a story that more authentically resonated with who they were. They were very much, let's do the work. We don't want to talk about ourselves, and so
Mm-hmm.
I helped them achieve that balance of, you guys are showing up in a way that very few agencies are. And so let's bring that out into the open and really talk about that, because it's precious. It is sacred. Like this is not normal for,
Mm-hmm.
the industry that you're in. And so I helped them with their messaging strategy, with their messaging, and really help them. This is how you need to position yourself. And out of that, again, on the heels of COVID, they were able to reach that milestone in their revenue growth that they were wanting to. And so that was really sweet, not just because they had this huge revenue goal, but because they are such incredible humans, like doing this very relationally centered work. So to be able to help somebody like that succeed, pretty
Mm-hmm.
fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm going to ask like the sort of stumper question that I sort of ask at the end of every podcast. Like, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you definitely want to share with the audience? And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to kind of take a moment to tell our audience that they definitely need to reach out to Lindsay, connect with her on LinkedIn. We'll be putting all her connection information in the show notes, because storytelling is a super important part of really anyone's life. It's not just business oriented, it's not just organizational or oriented, but your own personal brand. You need to be able to tell your story. And sometimes, like me, I am too close to the things that I'm doing to really be able to step back. Like in that example you just gave, you've got two seasoned marketers that know the industry, that know how to tell a story, but they're so close to their own story. It's kind of right in front of them, and they need someone to help draw that out. And Lindsay is very awesome at doing that. So again, urging the audience to reach out to her, connect with her, even if they just want to tell them tell their own story to Lindsay, because I'm sure she'd want to hear it. So, but yeah, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you definitely want to kind of share with the podcast community?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would share is, if listeners are listening to this and they're like, that sounds great, but there's a lot there. How do I really start to dig into this? If they head over to my site, there on the homepage, they'll see there's a free guide. You don't even have to enter in your information to download it. Just right there on my site. It's called How to Own Your Calling and Grow Your Impact. And it talks about these 3 story tools. And then you can grab, you can download a free journal that helps you practice these habits of story on a daily or weekly basis. It just kind of goes through that, gives you a template where you can just write these things down. You don't have to write a book every single day. You don't have to write sentences every single day. You may just be jotting down a phrase or an idea, so that it triggers you later when you're actually trying to pull some stories together. The goal is to just practice the habits in a regular way that works for you. But I would encourage you to look at that guide and to grab that journal, because it will help you actually put this stuff into motion.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Love free stuff. And that's definitely something we should point people to. So what's that web address, just so we can have those auditory learners?
It's storyhouse15.com, and it's all words, Storyhouse 15. There's no numbers.
Awesome. Well, Lindsay, you've been an absolutely terrific guest. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing a little bit about storytelling. I know there's a lot more, and that's why I encourage, again, the audience to connect with you. But thank you again for coming on and telling and sharing a little bit of your story.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of That Sounds Terrific. Don't forget to check out the show notes and our website at thatsoundsterrific.com to find the contact information and the best ways to volunteer with the organizations that we feature. If you know someone that is doing terrific things and think they should be featured in a future episode, be sure to email us their name, contact info, and short description of what they're doing at thatsoundsterrific@gmail.com. If you like our show, give us a 5-star rating and give us some social media love by liking our Facebook page, That Sounds Terrific. Follow us on Twitter at Sounds Terrific too, and Instagram at Sounds Terrific. We love hearing your feedback on how to make our show sound even more terrific. Till next time.